So in Module 7, we're going to go ahead and talk about adult intelligence. And so one of the things that we know about adult intelligence measures is that the scores are really good predictors in regards to job performance. And so if you look at a wide range of professions, those typically with the higher intelligence level tend to outperform those with the lower intelligence levels. Now, something that is important to note also is that those with higher intelligence level tend to have higher occupational prestige. In other words, they may not necessarily make more money all the time, but the prestige of the occupation they do choose tends to be higher. So, for example, even though a professor doesn't necessarily earn a lot of money, you're going to have a higher occupational prestige for that versus, say, somebody who is in sanitary disposal or something and makes the same amount of money, but it's viewed not as prestigious of a kind of occupation. And so you do see that pattern. And as I was mentioning earlier, it's going to also be related to IQ in the type of job performance. So if you're a boss, you usually want the people that are very smart around you because they're going to make you look good and they're going to probably perform better in the job that you give them. So, of course, it's not all good news. What you're going to see is that there is a decline in some of the mental abilities of individuals as they get older. So, usually, what the pattern is that you're going to see modest gains in the 30s and 40s, and even in the 50s. And then you begin to see scores begin to level off in the late 50s, early 60s, and then decline in the 60s and 70s. And then by the 80s, you see a much steeper decline. The declines that you're going to see most evident are going to be in places like fluid intelligence, which we talked about earlier with the Cattell and Horn theory. Verbal IQ usually doesn't change too much until the 80s. But your performance IQ, which is related to your fluid intelligence, tends to peak somewhere in your early 20s and then have a steady decline. And then one of the reasons for all of this is that your speed of processing is going to be directly related to your overall intelligence because the faster the little neurons are firing off in your head, the quicker you're going to think, the more effective you're going to be in your problem solving. And as you get older, they just don't fire as effectively. So the longitudinal studies indicate these kind of different outcomes as you go through, just as I was talking about with the verbal and crystallized intelligence, the performance IQ, and then, of course, your speed of information processing and how that declines. Okay. So it's important to kind of note this and how you would typically see these declines. On the next slide here, here's a visual representation of the IQ and occupational success that I was talking about earlier. You can see on the left-hand side the amount of income that high intelligence versus lower intelligence makes, and you can see where really the economy rewards those that have the higher intelligence because you see an ever-increasing salary there where it begins to level off for those with the lower IQ. And then you can also see as far as occupational prestige, which I was talking about earlier, once again, just increasing for those with high IQ. With those with lower IQ, you're actually seeing a decline over the years. Now, this next slide here is just a graphical representation of the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence, which is the Cattell and Horn theory we talked about in the first couple modules. And the crystallized intelligence, how it just keeps increasing there. But you can see where the peak of fluid or performance intelligence tends to be much earlier in life. And then the crystallized intelligence starts leveling off, but not until people reach their 70s. All of this has a cumulative effect, as you can see, of IQ declining with age. So by the time you start in your 40s to 50s, you kind of hit your top, and then you see that decline. Okay, so what would predict us to decline? Is it inevitable? Is that something we need to worry about? Well, the worse your health and the less stimulating your environment around you, the more likely you're going to see a decline. It's the old adage, you either use it or lose it. Just like with your body, your muscular strength, it's the same with your brain. The more you challenge it and put it in interesting situations, learning new content, the more likely that you're going to retain your intellectual abilities. Now, if you are in poor enough health, these are usually occurs with people towards the end of their life or with very significant health issues. You see their intelligence drop precipitously in something that's called a terminal drop, and it usually occurs in the lead up to someone dying. Okay? Those who are maintaining or gaining, so as long as you can break out of your kind of rut, intellectually stimulate yourself, then you're going to probably maintain. Now, those who maintain or gain, a lot of them have above average socioeconomic status, meaning that they are more affluent, can afford to go on more opportunities, expose themselves to more information than you would if you're more impoverished. Those that have intact marriages, so being married kind of has this way of encouraging you to explore areas maybe that you hadn't found before. For instance, I like showing a lot of documentaries on PBS and things. My wife, who I believe is way more intelligent than me, but she doesn't really prefer those type of shows. And yet, if it's on, she'll watch it with me and usually find them quite interesting. But we'll often say, you know, I never would have watched that if you hadn't had that on. And so it goes both ways. I get dragged to plays that I wouldn't necessarily go to and then find them to be quite invigorating. So being married certainly helps, and having an intellectually capable spouse is part of that. It's kind of interesting that as time goes by, our IQs become more and more similar to our partners in a good way. So if you marry somebody smarter than you, which is a good thing, they will only help raise up your IQ and you will not bring theirs down, which I think is a good trade-off. So find somebody smarter than yourself to marry. I certainly did. And then also having an active lifestyle. So getting out there, not just sitting back passively watching things, but actively engaging in the world is extremely important. Okay? So as I was saying earlier, what you want to do is kind of a use it or lose it mentality. And so it's important to kind of put yourself out there and really explore things. Now, as you get older, there is also the concept of somebody having wisdom. And wisdom is often associated in particular cultures with someone who is older. And what that means is that you have a constellation of really rich factual knowledge about life, and it's going to be combined with this kind of procedural knowledge, like strategies on how to give advice and handle conflict. And so it's a particular combination that includes things like intelligence, personality, and cognitive style, kind of all wrapped into one. Now, being simply old does not necessarily give you wisdom. Rather, it's the expertise that you might have, and of course, the immediate social context. So the social context, or where the problem or the wisdom is being sought, that person needs some sort of background in it. Otherwise, that would not be perceived as having wisdom. Okay, so if you are wise, you know, that's something that's going to be sought out for, and of course, that's an advantage of maybe being older and having more experience than it would be in other situations. Okay, so switching gears just slightly in adulthood to talk about creativity. We talked about how it declines a little bit between about 8 to 12 years old, then it picks up again. And what we see after that is that typical career patterns that we see here that develop is that in the 30s and 40s, you really see kind of a peak in creativity professionally. And then you see kind of a gradual decline afterwards. So the peak times, though, are going to really vary depending on what your specialty area is. So you can see on the slide here, productivity for scholars in humanities, well, kind of like psychology, it's going to peak in your 60s and can continue on into old age. But if you're a more pure scientist like chemistry, physics, your peak is going to be in the 40s and then kind of go back down in the 70s. And then finally, in the arts, you have it even smaller, where you're maybe peak in the 30s and 40s and kind of go down. Now, there's a variety of opinions as to why something like that will happen, and you can see the graph here of kind of the ups and downs. But something like the arts, people who are in a field like that, they just really need to consider maybe peaking with their originality sooner than later. And this kind of shows IQ differences over time. So we'll go ahead and hit the next module in just a sec.